Welcome to the third seminar in our series, the Gilman Foreign Policy and Focus Refugee and Migration Virtual Seminar Series. My name is Ellie Cohen, and I am the co-organizer of this seminar series, which is presented by the Gilman Scholarship, a program of the Department of State's Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs, and is hosted by the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies and the Center for the Study of Global Change at Indiana University.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Tarian Webb, and I am the other co-organizer of the seminar. Thanks to all of you who participated in our last session, our most recent session last week. And for those of you who are joining us anew this time, welcome. We're glad you're here.
So today we are shifting into a more localized perspective, and we're going to hear about three particular cases of forced migration around the world. So we'll hear about climate refugees, we'll hear about education in the Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya, and we'll hear about internal displacement and aid in Ukraine.
So our first speaker is Amali Tower, the founder and executive director of Climate Refugees. Amali has extensive global experience in refugee protection and refugee resettlement, and in forced migration and displacement contexts, working with numerous NGOs, UNHCR, and the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. You can read her full bio, or a fuller bio, in the link in the chat. So Amali, welcome.
Thank you, Torian. And thank you so much, Ellie, and to the school for Hamilton Lugar for inviting me. I'm coming to you, since you did ask, and it's kind of relevant, I'm coming to you from Bonn, Germany, where I'm here to attend the UN climate talks. That is the UN framework for Convention for Climate Change. Maybe many of you are more familiar with the annual meeting, which is kind of called the COP process, which is the Conference of Parties that happens every year. But that is kind of an extravaganza annual meeting. But there's a lot of work that goes on all year long, as well as in all the sort of, it's called the subsidiary bodies. So I've just left the UN headquarters to sort of run back to my hotel to make this. So apologies for the background. But that's a good context in which to come to you from, and also help me keep track of time, if you don't mind. I know this is we've got some limited time here. So let me, as I've been asked to do, is to speak to you about the issue of climate refugees, to present a case study from the Lake Chad Basin, which is the Sahel in Africa, and then leave some time for questions. So obviously, as the name implies, both the topic of climate refugees, but also the name of my organization, let me just sort of take a step back and sort of talk about this both from a personal and professional perspective. My knowledge in this is both lived and learned experience. I come from a background in refugee protection, working with the UN Refugee Agency, various NGOs, resettling refugees all around the world, or refugees based all around the world for the US State Department, which is the US Refugee Admissions Program. People can also seek refuge in the United States by doing so at its southern borders or its consulates, et cetera. And that would be the process of seeking asylum. Now, I founded Climate Refugees in 2015 because I was informed for many years preceding that by refugees themselves as to how much climate is a factor in driving their cross-border displacement. A refugee is someone with a that's a legal distinction. That is a legal status, and you would accede to that sort of legal status under the 1951 Refugee Convention, which I'm assuming you've gone through in your first discussion, as you mentioned, Ellie, since this seems to be the second discussion in this series. But real quickly, so because I don't want to assume everybody knows, the 1951 Refugee Convention defines a refugee as someone who has left their country, has a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and membership in a particular social group. Today, we also understand that people are fleeing persecution, conflict, generalized violence. You'll note then in what I mentioned in those 5 grounds, and that's what we call sort of the nexus grounds for which your persecution is, or fear, or whatever you're fleeing from, right, in conflict, is based on like the fact that your rights could be violated based on those 5 grounds. And you'll notice that climate change isn't there's nothing akin to climate change in that definition. Now, while working with all the actors I mentioned earlier, obviously my work was is possible because of that legal convention, right? Which is the cornerstone of refugee law, and is a body we use in international law. But that didn't change the fact that when I was interviewing people who had fled wars we all knew well, or asking them, why did you leave your country, or why can't you return, in the context of like maybe wondering if they should be resettled, which is a durable solution we pursue for refugees. I had refugees describe climate conditions, environmental degradation, food insecurity, drought, crop loss, and situations where they were already not feeding their families because of drought and food insecurity, and environmental degradation was also cited as a reason in terms of there's nothing to go back home to. And you would hear people describe this with the intersection, the interdependency of then how were armed actors in a conflict scenario sort of like capitalizing on these climate scenarios, how are fragile and conflict affected states or marginalized people who are already persecuted then that much more vulnerable to climate change and environmental degradation, and there was no sort of like state entity that could protect them. And that's what they were sort of talking to me about. So obviously in time I started to unpack that and realize, this is definitely a possible legal gap, right, in the convention, but also a very nuanced understanding of how climate intersects with socioeconomic issues, political drivers, specific marginalization that indigenous groups or politically, underrepresented populations, or, marginalized people for a variety of reasons. And you could sort of see how this sort of like there's a cross section with social justice issues, shall we say, right? Greatly speaking, the lack of social protections that marginalized people have in general, besides being a refugee. So that's what led to the founding of Climate Refugees. Now, before I get to the Sahel, let me give you some sort of like background right now as to where does this stand. We've come a long way since I founded the organization and the few years preceding that, where some work was starting to be done in by some UN, not the UN, but by some state-led initiatives to try and identify that whether this is happening, to what extent, and how much do we know about it. And up to now, much of the work has been about data and research and modeling and projecting how climate change might drive disasters, and how those disasters are going to displace people primarily within their own countries. There's been very little opportunity, and I would also say political interest, to document how are climate impacts, both sudden onset events, which is terminology you'll hear in the UN climate discussions, which are disasters, cyclones, storms, hurricanes, and slow onset events like drought, rising sea levels, environmental degradation, deforestation, salinization of waters if you're an island state, right, and you're completely dependent on growing your own food or importing everything. Rising sea waters doesn't just mean, oh, when the water is over your island or your head. It really means, how has salinity compromised the soil and therefore your food security. these are examples of slow onset events. So there's very little focused information on how slow onset events are also driving displacement. And then I would also say there's very little information on how both these climate impacts, sudden and slow, are driving displacement across borders. And it's when people are driven across borders that we can really, broadly speaking, talk about refugee and asylum and the international protection, international asylum system being triggered. Now, that's one truth. You have to have crossed an international boundary to even, if you remember the definition that I described. But then there's also the other issue of climate is not one of those 5 grounds, right? Race, religion, nationality, political opinion, social group. So all that said, it doesn't change the fact that as of yesterday, UNHCR released its latest global numbers, and we have reached 110 million people that are forcibly displaced in the world today. Once again, it is an astronomically high number. It just goes up every single year. Last year, it was 100 million, for example, right? In the mid-year, we got up to 103.5. Now we're at 110. Ukraine has added a lot of numbers to this, but by no means that's the reason. Now, in many years, not all of those people are refugees. Some of them are refugees. 35 million or so people are refugees. Then you have asylum seekers. You have internally displaced persons, and then you have other people who may not even have a category. And I would say climate refugees, for all the reasons that I've already said, would fall under this internally displaced, as well as like a category we may not even have, a meta title for. So much so that we also have internal displacement numbers that tell us that just this year already, we know that 32.6 million people were displaced at the end of last year. And that's a 41% uptick over the last decade of the amount of people that are displaced by climate-related events. The total number of displacements was like 60-something million, but 32.6 million is climate-driven, extreme weather-related event displacements. That is, by and large, that's sudden onset category. So we're still not really documenting the slow onset, like drought in the Horn of Africa, where about 40 million people are affected right now. The Sahel, which I'll come back to. And then also, it's only internal displacement. It's not really capturing the cross-border. Okay, moving along very quickly, I'll say that not only do we have a gap in protection, we have a gap in information, we have a gap in data, and we have a gap in understanding how these issues intersect with existing vulnerabilities, with existing socioeconomic and social protection barriers that such populations have, and how does that actually drive migration and displacement, both internally and across borders. That is jutting up against an increasingly authoritarian governments all around the world, and a very xenophobic culture towards refugees and migrants and just, people on the move in general. So most states are adopting very heavy border security and externalizations and pushbacks of their borders that don't allow people to actually seek protection for whatever reason, whether it's conflict, violence, or climate. Even though we know that more people now are displaced by climate than even conflict or violence, and in many years, it's 3 times as many people are displaced by climate-related events, both, definitely internally. Across borders, we can only speculate. So this is the landscape. Now, when I founded Climate Refugees, one of the first things I did after getting sidelined a bit with Syria response, I came back to the work and I went to the Lake Chad Basin in the Sahel. And that is Central and West Africa and the Sahel region, where a number of states are in conflict. But the Lake Chad Basin it derives its name because of Lake Chad, which is shared by Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. Over the last 50 plus years, the lake has shrunk over 90%. Where it's understood that at least half of the reasons why the lake has shrunk is due to climate climate-related events, extreme temperatures, a lack of rains, and high rates of evaporation. Now, it's important to note that about 40 million people are dependent upon the lake, live around the lake, and are dependent around the lake, both for water, for livelihood, for resources. These are fishing communities, and these are communities who historically, anthropologically, do not identify necessarily as Nigerian, Cameroonian. We have to understand that borders for a lot of places in the world, especially African countries, are colonial constructs, right? These are populations who share a similar ethnicity, a similar livelihood, a similar ethno-linguistic background, and they may move from one country to the next. And in fact, the refugees and IDPs, which are internally displaced persons that I've met in the Sahel, in the Lake Chad Basin, will lead with identifying as saying, I'm from the Lake Chad Basin versus I'm from Nigeria. So these were populations that were already on the move anyway. I went there because a conflict broke out in 2009 between the group Boko Haram and Nigeria. And that has now spilled over into the rest of those three countries, to where there's well over 5 million people are displaced, both across borders and internally. There's a number of people that are returning. So there's an issue of like, how do you return people to what? So I went there to ask people a fundamental question, which is, what was your driver of displacement, and to find out whether climate played a role at all, given what I've just told you about the Lake Chad Basin, the lake. And what I discovered was that, one, most people had been internally displaced within the Lake Chad Basin several times due to climate reasons, because they had to keep moving closer and closer to the lake, which was rapidly shrinking. And even when there were rains and it would like refill again, the rate of evaporation was so fast that they had to keep moving it closer anyway. That they had been displaced multiple times. And that meant that impacted their ability to send their children to school, because this is a highly marginalized and underdeveloped region of people who are not politically supported in their own countries. And so these were people who were foregoing school, who were having livelihood loss, who were now vulnerable to recruitment, especially for young boys, recruitment into the militant group Boko Haram, which is an Islamist militant group. So a number of human rights violations are also taking place there. You could understand it as like a setback on development goals, like the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Now, as people were displaced multiple times because of the climate conditions, and because the lake was drying, it was also freeing up the lake bed, allowing Boko Haram to be able to drive across what would have been a body of water, but now a lake bed, to actually like attack and raid and a host of horrific human, attacks and violations that have taken place in these villages that have been traumatized. So people fled the conflict, but what I found out was that as early as 1973 was the first instance or testimonies of refugees who told me that was the first date that they were forced to forcibly displaced as a result of the lake drying because of climate change. So that's kind of what the Sahelian context looks like. That was in 2017, and I don't have time to tell you about other places, but I'll just very quickly touch upon, because I think someone else is speaking about Dadaab. I've lived in Kenya for a long time. I've been in the Dadaab camp a lot. I've lived in Kakuma refugee camp, which is Kenya's other big camp, and I just returned from late last year doing climate displacement work in Kenya, a middle-income country, visiting 8 different sites where Kenyans are incredibly vulnerable and are being displaced, and long-standing land tenure and some conflicts between inter-counties are sort of being resuscitated because of climate conditions. This is happening to pastoralists, this is happening to fishing communities, and Kenya is part of the Greater Horn of Africa drought that is now on its 6th failed rainy season. About 40 million people have been affected at the height of it. It's now slightly a little bit less. Over 10 million livestock are dead. About 30 million people are at food insecurity levels of famine. And there's a huge donor appeal just last week or 2 weeks ago now for $7 billion that is urgently needed to support just the humanitarian response in Kenya. To say nothing of the Sahel, by the way, which is another sort of forgotten crisis. And this latest crisis in the Horn of Africa, which is all climate driven and where there are also conflicts like in Ethiopia and Somalia. I also went to Somalia on this trip, where over 1.4 million people are displaced by this climate driven drought. You know, the donor appeal was has only produced about 2.5, just under $2.5 billion. I add that little note, even though that's not really the crux of our conversation, to point out how asymmetrical the system is in terms of like identifying why people are on the move, solutions to protect their basic human rights. Instead, we repel people. We just had another boat drown yesterday. 100 some people, I think it's 79, but numbers growing every day in Greece. You'll notice a lot of the populations I just described were on those boats.
Now, my pleasure to turn the microphone over to our next speakers, who are Mark Okello-Oyat and Sarah Ismail. Mark is a Ugandan refugee residing in Dadaab, Kenya. He has taught refugee students of different levels within Dadaab. He holds a master's degree from York University in Toronto, Canada. And currently he is the East Africa Regional Representative of the Tertiary Refugee Students Network and the director of the Dadaab Response Association, a refugee-led organization. And Sarah Ismail was born in Somalia and has lived in the Dadaab refugee camp since its inception in 1991. She has worked as a deputy head teacher of Care International Kenya and received her bachelor degree through the Borderless Higher Education of Refugee program with York University in Toronto, Canada, where she also received her master's degree. She is the co-director of the Dadaab Response Association. So Mark and Sarah, over to you two.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting us for this wonderful presentation. I will give the mic to Sarah to start first, and then I kick off after her. Sarah, please.
Thank you very much, Mark Okello. And to begin with, I just want to say the overview because of time limited. And Dadaab is located in Northeastern Province, as shown in the map. And Dadaab is a home for many refugees that fled from war conflict zones, including Somalia, Uganda, and Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Sudan, and many among other countries. And Dadaab is a refugee from I think and consists of and Dagahale, Hagadera, and Ifokam. And it was established in 1991. And the United Nations High Commission for Refugee, UNHCR, and other implementing agents of FAS, human services and I mean humanitarian services and protection for the refugees living in the Dadaab camp. And the population as stated of January of this year indicates 233,822 people are those people living currently as captured by the UNHCR. And if we look the age gap of from 0 to 17 is 50%, and 18 to 59 is 47%, and 60 and above is less than 3%. Gender that of the refugees consist in the DAP, male and female. The male is 51%, and the female are 49%. Women and children are 75% of the population. And there is, and let me go to the schools in the DAP camps. And there are two operational categories of education system delivered to the refugees living in the DAP. There is a formal and non-formal education, that is the secular and the religion system. The non-formal system is funded by UNHCR and other implementing agents, and then non-formal education is is a community-based organization, a community-based and because of the secular, and the primary level is under the implementing agent called Lutheran World Federation, and the secondary level is by Windle Trust International, Windle International Kenya. We have 6 secondary schools and 25 primary schools, but due to the availability that has increased for education, the refugees and the host community and the host people living in the DAP and decided to establish private schools to cater the needs of the refugees. And these schools, there are 22 secondary schools and 30 primary schools that are private currently running in the refugee, in the DAP camps. And education initially and in the refugee camps was initiated by the refugee teachers, because there was no teachers and during that time, and the teaching and classes used to be under a 3. But later on, in around 1992, this was taken by the International Care International in Kenya, which was taught still by Somali curriculum. But later on, they adapted the system or the curriculum system of Kenya. In 1997, the Kenya curriculum in IFO was the first, and the candidate were only 10 people who set for the Kenyan Certificate of Primary Education. And in 1998, all those candidates passed to high school, although there was no any other students that set for the primary certificate. All the 3 camps then open to the curriculum, and the refugees up to now, they are still adapted that curriculum, which is benefited from many beneficiaries. Okay, can we continue from the slides? No. Hello?
Okay. Sarah, can I take over from there?
Okay, you can chop it.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah, for the presentation that you have given. I beg to close my video because of internet connectivity so that it becomes stable. As you are aware, the issue of education has been very important in the context of human development. And you are also aware that many possibilities have been created by the international community by creation of different bodies, including the Education in Emergency, which was created to cater for the precarious situation within the context of displacement and forced migration. And possibly, I was not there in the first webinar, but this education in emergency has always been contested up to the point where, if you follow the history, you'll find out that at one time it was being funded by the Dutch, funding UNICEF, and then they did maybe quite a lot of research. And those research papers eventually disappeared and went to the USA. It is now found there. So UNICEF has always been in a dire state of survival. But in the context of the global commitment for the refugee education, you should be aware that by 2019, there was only 1% of refugee population in the context of higher education or tertiary education. But then they went and gathered in Berlin in Germany and discussed the way forward. And in that year, 2019, there were pledges which were made to ensure that refugee education for the tertiary education should be by 2030, should reach 15%. But that 15% is a global dimension which cannot be uniformly distributed across all the countries where refugees do stay. Possibly in Europe or in Germany, it can be higher, or in the United States or America can also be very high. But if we look at the position where the refugees themselves do come from, the most problematic places and the host communities, like the third nations who do host a lot of refugees, that percentage may not be reached. So we have the issue of sustainable development goal 4.5, which is directed to education. And then we also had the New York Declaration on Refugee and Migrants, which also recognizes the issue in relation to education, like that of the vulnerable people and persons with disability. And specifically now, when we come to East Africa, we had the Djibouti Declaration on refugee education, which was geared towards inclusive education for all the refugees. So in any country where refugees are within the IGAD, that is the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which consists of Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia. We have South Sudan. We have also Sudan and Uganda. They should have complied with that one by 2017. But if we consider that one, from where I stay, that is in Kenya, it is only this year that we have seen a bit of that sort of thing being implemented with refugee students who passed from elementary school to high school. They were integrated into the Kenyan secondary schools. But if we go deep, we'll find that integration is not admitting students to these Kenyan schools which have been there is even very precarious, because it is the low level schools that most of them have gone to, high school. but not these ones that are national. Next, please. Next slide. Can we go? Yeah. So that is something that is there, but with many research activities that we have done, one of us, members of the Dadaab Response Association, conducted a research. Is in Somalia, and he found out that if a refugee is educated, that one gives us now the fourth durable solution. You are aware from Amali's explanation about resettlement as one of the options that refugees do have. And we also have local integration. And also we have return, that is repatriation. But in the context of education, the researcher said there is also a fourth durable solution that should be considered, and that is education. Because with education, if a refugee is fully educated, that person can have high chances of living wherever he or she goes. So we have seen with the youth living in Dadaab camps that they would return to their countries of origin for developmental purposes. They go and join the government for development purposes or the other organizations so that they can develop the countries. And these educated refugees have become leaders. Some of them have become members of parliament. Some have become ministers within, like the example of Somalia, which has been a very precarious nation. At one time, a failed state completely, but at the moment it is trying to recover and has some sort of leadership, which is so great there. And most of the refugees from the camps are the ones who do go there to help in the job opportunities and running the country. And with that, we have seen that if they're educated, they can earn well, they can support their families, and they can also advocate for the people, the vulnerable refugee community. The example is the Dadaab Response Association that we had. We are a group of researchers. We do advocacy, and also we look at the best possible way so that refugees can really live a better life. And our motto is make it better, because we have to make refugee life better, and also day by day, we have to change to ensure that we live a better life, even if we live encampment, because this is something which is not permanent. It should be left in a good space. So we have seen that one, and that's the kind of thing that we are going through. Next slide, please. So from this context, we have seen that opportunities for tertiary education in encampment or within the refugee community in Kenya has been very meager, very small, where there are opportunities for them to go for the DAFE scholarship. Then we have the World University Service of Canada, which is called WUSC. They go on a yearly basis, but those are very small quarters. And it is in 2013 and 2020 that the Canadian government, through the Global Affairs Canada, gave funding to some universities in Canada and some local universities in Kenya to run a project for 7 years. And that produced over 400 refugees who got certificates, oral diplomas, oral undergraduate degrees, and masters. And that was a very good opportunity because they were learning from home and also able to create a lot of changes within the community. And this has been a wonderful thing. And in the perspective of the Dadaab Response Association, we are also joined an organization which a network which is called the AHIN. AHIN is an initial for African Higher Education in Emergency Network. The idea, ideally, it is that education within encampment should be focused in generating solutions to the problems that we do have here in the camp or in Africa. But the question is, however good that idea is, who can fund you? So with that context of lack of funding, we are still not able to kick. We start doing something wonderful because the network is comprising of universities, with organizations, and we are a community-based organization that we do think that education should be meaningful for the community. And we are the people who are in the community. We have to run a meaningful education for the purpose of solving the pertinent solutions that we do have in the community. You can visit our research work and you realize that the kind of work that we have done, like for instance, the research agenda is purely directed towards the issues that we have within our community. And we have been doing it with our positionalities as refugee researchers in encampment. So it is an insider's sort of work that we have done for the purpose of thinking how education can be meaningful and can generate knowledge and solutions from the issues that and challenges that we are experiencing here in the camp or within our communities. Next slide, please. As I said, this has not been very easy because education in emergency, I wouldn't say in emergency, but in a protracted situation, because the Dadaab has already stayed for over 30 years. So the question comes, how long is education becomes emergent in a given period of time? It is very unpredictable. And Dadaab, that in the context of the Dadaab's case, it was meant or thought that it would just stay for a short time. As Sarah told you that from the beginning, the education was in the Somalia curriculum. That was because they thought refugees would only stay for 2, 3, 4, 5 years and then go back to Somalia. So there was no need putting them into the Kenyan curriculum. But with the continuous challenges in Somalia, it became a precarious situation where the children had to learn within the host community. That is, has brought us to this current situation. But still, we lack funding to sustain the refugee education in Dadaab, and houses are not enough. Students are always so many in a class. You find that over 100 students in one class. So the proportion is not standard. It lacks the minimum standard of one teacher to 40 students. So we lack also the training for teachers is not there because we come from class to class. If you read some of our articles, you'll find that that one has been highlighted. Somebody finishes the high school this year, and the next year, the person goes to teach. What does that mean? Without any proper knowledge, and will be teaching like what he or she has experienced from the teacher, but not with the content of who a teacher should be. So we have that one, and also those many people who have already got certificates or qualified to have access to tertiary education are not able to do that one. And so many are at home And that has created also a big issue. And a student or somebody who has qualified, who cannot join high school, who cannot go to tertiary education for higher education, always remaining at home, has created a situation where a lot of students, those who have left education, go for drug abuse. And you should know that this state or this area is also in an insurgent environment where it becomes very problematic if no solution can be sorted out to contain those who have successfully qualified. And the biggest challenge goes to the girls who have passed to go to tertiary education and cannot manage. The end result is only to get married because they can do nothing. So this is a situation that is very wanting, but refugees can do nothing about it. And still up to now, we see that refugees are not included into the education policy within the country. So that one is also very precarious because they are segregated. They learn in the camps, they don't go to the host community schools and mix and integrate together as students. Next slide, please. So in our context, as refugee educators and advocates, we have decided to do quite a lot of advocacy, both locally, nationally, and globally. An example, we can say that in 2020, there was a serious lockdown because of COVID-19. The camp was under lockdown, and refugees were restricted from moving. And after that one, because of lack of funding in 2021, when schools resumed in Kenya, the schools within the DAP, where the teachers were only supposed to be 7. Those 7 teachers for every primary school, whether the primary school contained 1,500 students or 3,000 students, they were to have only 7 teachers on the ground. And then you could imagine with that protocols of COVID-19, 1 meter distance apart. And then the control of children who are very young, it was not easy. So we advocated through our network to the people who are concerned, because this was the issue which UNHCR had already brought on the ground, plus the implementing partners, to reduce the number of students like this. We wrote our mails, we advocated, and within 1 month, everything was brought to normal, money was sourced, and life continued. So our research and writing, the writings that we do, as I've already told you, is just within the DAP on the issue of education mostly, even though we at times get certain emerging issues that are very peculiar within the context of research. Because as a researcher, sorry?
I'm going to interrupt and let you know you have 1 minute left.
Okay, thank you. So
sure.
we do guiding and counseling, peer mentoring for the university going students and helping them to finish their assignment. We teach also refugee students. We act like role models, especially the females, because over here we really have a big challenge for the refugee girls. They need peer mentors and role models.
Today, it is my pleasure to introduce Tatiana Bulach, a senior manager for Europe at the National Endowment for Democracy, where Tanya oversees more than 150 projects that support civil society, human rights defenders, and independent media in Eastern Europe. Prior to joining the National Endowment for Democracy, Tanya worked with UN agencies in Ukraine, including UNHCR and UNICEF. She holds a PhD in sociocultural anthropology from Indiana University, Bloomington, and her dissertation research focused on internal displacement, citizenship, and humanitarian aid in Ukraine. So Tanya, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure and such an honor to be here today with you and to present the case that is close to me and that I deeply care about. So as you just heard, my presentation today is based on the research that I have conducted for my dissertation project and is based on the field work that I've conducted in Ukraine back in 2017, 2018. But because of the nature of my work, I still, actively engage with what's going on in Ukraine. I'm originally from Ukraine too, and ironically, last year when Russia started the full-scale invasion on Ukraine, my own family became internally displaced. So this cause is very close to my heart, both professionally and personally. But I'm happy to talk to you about this today and answer any questions. The structure of today's presentation is the following. I start with discussing the data on forced displacement. Amali generously just flagged some of the data in her presentation. I'll elaborate a little bit and outline the difference between refugees and internally displaced people, or IDPs as I refer to them, and then I will move to discuss the case of Ukraine, some more specifics, background, but also focus on the current developments and the challenges that displaced people face in Ukraine. And lastly, I will focus on the humanitarian responses and more specifically material aid. That's my area of interest, things like provision of clothes, household items, or food items that constitutes material aid. So let's start with the first slide of the presentation. And as you can see, this global tendencies report published by UNHCR, and I will ask, can you please go ahead and press the button so that we can see the updated number, because on the graph, you see the data on the forced migrants recorded from 1991 to 2021. And you can see how starting from like 2011, this number is growing, is increasing. This was the data for the mid-2022. And you can tell I was not preparing my slides last night because the new report that covers the data on 2022 were just published. And we now know, as Amali mentioned earlier today, that the total number of forced migrants around the world is over 110 million people. This is the highest number that during the time that this data was tracked. What I want to point out today is that roughly 75% of displaced population are internally displaced people. So as of today, roughly 70 million people are internally displaced. It is also important to underline that among all these internally displaced people, the majority of population are women, children, and elderly people. I don't want to oversimplify and to compare what's the difference between internally displaced IDPs or refugees. They face similar but yet different challenges in their lives. But let me point out one thing. And again, like I'm referring here to Amali, connecting the dots for you, but refugees, they seek international support and are subject of international protections. And this is a legal status for them to be a refugee. IDPs rely primarily on the state for protection and support. And here is why it's problematic or paradoxical, because quite often the state itself is a part of the reason they are displaced, either by not preventing the conflict or like a civil war confrontation, or by not providing sufficient response to the environmental disaster that drives people to be displaced people. This creates different tensions, frictions, and even marginalization or exclusions of displaced people within their own community of citizens. And I also want to highlight that internal displacement, it affects most and foremost vulnerable people, those who might not rely on their financial resources or exhaust their savings or do not have sufficient social safety nets to reestablish their life. To me, this is a very the humanitarian aid in that sense, and material aid becomes a critical point of interaction and negotiation between different actors, like displaced people, the state as the the entity that provides security guarantees to its citizens, but also peer citizens and other actors who can provide humanitarian support. And I will elaborate on this a little bit later in this presentation, but now let's move to the next slide. On the left image, you can see the map of Europe, where I highlighted Ukraine, which is the largest country in Europe if you talk about the size. And on the right picture, you see the areas that were affected in 2014 by the start of the Russian aggression. So the war started not last year, but back in 2014, when Russia first occupied Crimea and then get involved into the armed conflict. I say conflict, but it's part of the war in eastern Ukraine. And these were the areas where, that were affected in 2017-18 when I was conducting the ethnographic research. Now let's move to the next slide. And this is the present day picture, more or less. These are the areas that are currently occupied by Russian forces. In 2022, Russia launched a full-scale aggression on Ukraine, aiming to overthrow the Ukrainian government. But I will not go into those details. In terms of displacement, it's important to highlight that the total of the population of Ukraine is about roughly 40 million people. Today, nearly a third of Ukrainians have been forced to flee their homes. That means refugees and internally displaced people. So the number of displaced people as of today is roughly 6 million people. Let's move to the next slide. So far I've been talking about numbers, but I do want to emphasize that these are not just numbers, these are all people, and each number represents someone's life, someone's decision to leave their home, someone's story. And so today I want to take a few minutes and tell you one of these stories of internally displaced person. And I found it interesting for two reasons. The first one, this is not representative for the main demographic group of IDPs. This is a story about a man who is comparatively well off and who lives with his family. So it's not, like I mentioned before, a woman or a child. The second point is that this story to me illustrates how displacement can suddenly, quite abruptly, become a dramatic change in life, and what kind of challenges and difficulties people face when they are displaced within their own country. So on the right picture, you see an elderly man. He's in late 50s, and his name is Roman. He stays in the backyard of the village house that he lives in. I met him in 2018 in the village of Krasnohorivka, which is the Donetsk region of Ukraine. At the time when I interviewed him, the village was so close to that front line that the grounds outside of his house were covered with empty bullet shells. And just a few weeks before we met for the conversation, a military post was located right in his driveway. Roman is a displaced person. I don't know his status as of now, but at the time of the conversation, he was a displaced person. Before the war started in 2014, he had been preparing for his retirement, and with no children of their own, he and his wife wanted to move closer to the family and to live in the village and to have that kind of support. Roman bought a small house and a very old and a plot of land. And he dreamed to have a small farm, to do something that he has no chance to do during his life. But these were all plans. In 2014, when the war came to his home city of Donetsk, he tried to stay with his family there, but when the rocket hit the apartment complex on his block, he rushed to move his wife and his 80-year-old father to the village house. And on the left slide, you can see this small kitchen in their house, and the elderly father sitting there. He has very limited mobility, and Roman is a main caregiver for him. So he moved his family, but he went back to the city to collect some belongings. And in that short period of time, the roads got closed. He was quite desperate because his wife has a disability, his father is sick, his father was sick, so it was not that he could leave them for a prolonged period of time. So being quite desperate, he decided to walk back to the village. Despite the fact that the area around the city was already contaminated with landmines, making it super dangerous, but also it was covered by almost 2 feet of snow during the winter months. But Roman decided to walk back home to the village house. By the time he reached the house, his feet became frostbitten, and his wife called an ambulance, but they couldn't make it because of the snow, because of the distance. So finally, when he made it to the hospital, all 10 of his toes had to be amputated. What was remarkable for me when I interviewed Roman was that in order to get, when he was telling this story, he was not talking about his physical trauma, that to me was a little bit, shocking, or not talking about the fear of living so close to the front line. The most significant challenge and concern he had was that he had a very difficult time to access his father's pension. So at that time, Ukraine implemented several verification procedures for internally displaced people to receive their pension. And so this required him to take his father once in 3-4 months physically to the bank office of the state bank to go through the physical verification that would help them to release the funds of his pension to the bank card. So this struggle with the bureaucracy was very challenging, and he was extremely bitter about this. But it was also compounded with the overwhelming, I would say, sense of loss. And what I argue in my research and my study, it's not just a loss of material belonging or apartment back in Donetsk or possessions that they had, but the loss of normalcy and stability. And I will ask to switch to the next slide. Displacement is an existential condition for many people. And one of the key challenges that they face is their inability to plan their future, not knowing whether they will come home, not knowing whether they will start the farm like they planned before, or for parents and people with kids, it's inability to plan the next school year. Some things like on this picture, you see very simple things like utensils and a bottle opener. They quite often become a very painful reminders of the things that people used to have as a part of their everyday routine, but no longer have and need to reacquire. And in some sense, humanitarian response and provision of material aid is quite logical response, because when people lose things, you try to replace them in simplified terms and provide them. But again, like the challenge that people face is not just about the loss of their belongings, but the loss of stability and predictable future. And I will ask to move to the next slide. So I'm moving to the third block of this presentation, the provision of humanitarian assistance. As I mentioned, provision of material aid like clothes, food, or household items can be seen as a very logical way to support displaced people. However, the alarming tendency that many professional humanitarian organizations are now moving away from the material support and provide what is called resilience building or capacity building of forced migrants. And this is the dilemma that we all often illustrate with, like whether to provide people with fish or a fishing pole so that they can be providers for themselves. Well, when it comes to protracted displacement, during the crisis time, during the initial crisis time, of course, like the provision of material aid is not under the question. But then when it comes to protracted displacement, that's where these issues arise more and more. And to me, and according to the study that I conducted, that material aid and this provision of material aid remains quite important throughout the protracted displacement as well, because it's a tangible response. It's the way to communicate to people that there is some stability, some predictability, and the way to address the needs that they identify. So not every humanitarian response is similar, but when it's systematic, when it's predictable aid, and when it responds to the local needs, that is the solution that would be probably close to ideal. Throughout the fieldwork, I worked with 3 types of actors that provide humanitarian aid: international organizations, private business sector, and local NGOs and volunteers. So I will ask to move to the next slide. You can see that different on the top of the slide. You can see pictures from one of the volunteer centers where people were collecting aid to provide it to to displaced people per their request. And then on the bottom of the slide, you see two pictures of the private sector support or a big foundation that was providing more systematic aid. And I will just be because we have limited time, I will just outline that each provider has their strengths and weaknesses. What I want to highlight that throughout the research, I found out that this overwhelming solidarity and response from volunteers, from NGOs, those who were peer support, was not providing just material aid, but also solidarity with their peer citizens, which was a factor that I thought was making this aid quite valuable and meaningful. On the side of the private sector, their financial ability and logistical networks that enabled them to provide systematic support made them one of the most influential providers in the region, war-affected region, and many people would recognize them and be grateful because what they developed is the food packages that they will deliver to people once in 2-3 months, and that created that predictability of support. So let's move to the next slide. This is the chart or like the infographics that illustrate that when the full-scale invasion started, it was exactly the private sector and the civil society on the ground and local initiative, volunteer initiative, who were the first to respond to the needs of displaced people, who were the first to respond to humanitarian crisis, to mobilize their horizontal network, provide the material items as a support, and to help people with their relocation. To sum up and to highlight 3 takeaways of this presentation, I would just point out that the first takeaway is that, or the first takeaway that I want you to have as a takeaway is that the number of internally displaced people has been drastically growing globally, and among all forced migrants, internally displaced people is the majority of the population. The second is that displacement is a lasting condition and it's an existential condition. So it doesn't last for a year or 2, but often for decades. And the people may face their major difficulties and challenges when the public attention and initial solidarity, they fade away. And the third one is that displacement, and most importantly, assistance to displacement, should always be grounded in the local context, the needs that people identify as their needs, and not to adopt the top-down approach. So on this note, I will wrap up and see if there are any questions. Thank you so much.